Perfect.
Tony, going back to what you said about building the dam in Ghana, and I think there was a similar type thing. Other people might know much more than me, but there was a similar type thing in Egypt where
Right.
the British offered to build a dam on the Nile River. But in the end, Nasser kicked them out, and they ended up building, I guess, the tallest dam in the world or something.
Yeah, the high Aswan.
They built the Aswan Dam, and they were asking for the United States to help them, and Britain. And of course, the United States policy was conflicted. The Russians offered to help them, and he went with the Russians' help. And they built this great dam and had a big lake and an electric power plant there. When Kennedy came in office, he and Jackie tried to begin mending fences with Nasser. They're working with people like Nehru. They're trying every which way in the neutralist movement to get around this problem of the Anglo-Americans like Gore saying, let's not help these people that go to the Russians. Why? You want them to go to the Russians, right? Is that the idea? That's obviously what's going on.
Yeah, yeah.
So Jackie Kennedy brought up the fact that the dam was going to flood these ancient ruins of Abu Simbel and offered American help, not to stop the dam, but to say, okay, this is a great project. We want to help you rescue your past. And they moved all of these statues and buildings. In the dam in Ghana, Jackie Kennedy was supposed to go there to dedicate it when it was dedicated a week before Nkrumah was overthrown. She couldn't come, but she had asked for a plaque to be put on the dam, which is there to the present day, honoring President Eisenhower, who tried to help and was interfered with, and President Kennedy for building the dam.
Tony, you mentioned the non-aligned movement. Can you say anything about how? I thought of Nehru when you mentioned him. Can you speak to anything about how they were functioning? We've got this polarized world with the Iron Curtain business.
The non-aligned movement is, as far as I can see, with some exceptions, which are mainly Russian intrusions into it, are all of this order. They're all people that are trying to follow the lead of some initiative that's going to make their country, to rescue their countries from, here we have, what's the situation? The World War II is over, and the British Empire, the French Empire, these are weak. The Americans are strong. Franklin Roosevelt has issued the challenge. The Atlantic Charter is what woke up all these people all over the world, everywhere. 1941. What's World War II about? That's what it's about. Our freedom over in Africa, over in Asia, obviously in India. Franklin Roosevelt sent a mission to India in 1943. And to see what the people of India, the government of India under the British, was doing to produce the materials for our side in World War II. They found to their horror that the British had jailed, again, both Gandhi and Nehru, and had thwarted any serious attempts by India to produce anything. They're not going to let them go beyond the first big steel complex that Americans had helped them build back in the beginning of the 20th century, the Tata Steel Works. And they blasted the British for this. They said, this is insane. You're saying that even the British troops aren't going to get supplied by big new industry in India. They could. They got plenty of people, and they have lots of skills there. That, it's a devastated, poor country, but they could do this right away. The model that was at that time on the minds of people looking at what the third world could do is Brazil. Rich Freeman is working on a big report on this, on the Cook mission and the whole policy, the Good Neighbor. But in the book by Morris Cook, he describes the question, can Brazilians who are not only poor and undernourished, suffering from terrible diseases of all kinds, social diseases, parasite disease, all kinds of things, no education, and most importantly, no tradition allowed to them under the imperial system, Portugal and then after that, no tradition of invention and discovery guiding the work. Can such people suddenly be transformed into a modern labor force? And without the prior organization of a vast sea of middle-class managers and so forth? And the answer was unequivocally yes. And he gave example after example of people, and these are, it's a half or majority black people from, descended from Africans in Brazil. And there's also immigrants from Europe of various kinds. The ordinary worker making 3 cents a day, no education. And when you introduce a new process and a spirit of, initiative that's backed by the government, Vargas went to the workers and to the the commercial classes and said, this is what we're doing. Roosevelt's backing us and is paying for half of this. Organize yourselves. Organize syndicates. These are not Mussolini syndicates. This is like Bismarck, really. And when you do this, as Cook points out in his book, overnight, people pick this up if they're not murdered, if they're not just completely squashed. And you get the transformation of a large number of people, place after place, into skilled workers. He's a guy who never did any skilled work and never had any acquaintance with modern technology, is hired to work in, in one type of work, maybe electrical work or steel making, and rapidly gets all the skills around him. Another guy who was given a job in electrical work, within a short time after that, he had some working experience in some kind of shop, okay, which is better than peasants. But then within a few months, he has learned 20,000 words of English, including 14,000 terms of electrical devices and allied. What is it?
It was the oil industry, but the point you're making is absolutely correct.
Well, but you look it up. There's one thing where he's talking about an electrical supply shop. But you're right. He's talking about the oil industry as well. So my point is that these questions, along with the question of if somebody invests in these countries, will they get their money back? And the routine answer from everybody associated with FDR, just like with Lincoln, just like with Hamilton, is it depends. You're not going to get your money back if you're just sucking their blood or you're speculating. But if you are deliberately building up their industry and their power to produce, then there's a future in it and you get your money back, especially if the government backs you up in different ways. But it's not, like the Hurley Memorandum points out about Iran. This doesn't cost the taxpayers anything. Iran's got plenty of resources. Why can't they just use their resources to build up their country with our help, with our encouragement? And the answer is, which is stated everywhere by both FDR and his representatives and Kennedy and his people, or at least the ones who were really his people, not the ones who were out to kill him who were next to him, that if you build something over there, it's going to work out. And we are not going to worry that they are getting powerful. That's to our advantage. They'll buy more from us and so forth. If they're industrialized, if they have capabilities of a high wage and modern society, we have better, more profitable business in our trade with Europe that's industrialized than we do with these poor countries. Why not industrialize them? And everybody involved knows that the issue has nothing to do with real finances. It has to do with simple power to squash people. That's all it's about. So this is in the period after World War II. You get through this period up to various nationalist movements. Kennedy is there, and this nationalist movement goes up. It's a neutralism headed by people like Nehru. And all of them want good relations with the United States, and none of them are really run by the communists. And as we know from certain things, the communists aren't even run by the communists. So that's another problem, right, that we have to deal with, right? In the Mossadegh rebellion, or his movement to take over Iran, part of what he did when he became prime minister was to publish things that were not in the New York Times. He published it in Iran that said, we have found these documents in the home of the British Oil Company that's been dominating our country for decades. These are documents showing that the British have paid communists to have riots as communists. They're foolish people, those people, who would do that. So the attitude of Kennedy, and there was a slide I didn't bother putting in because there's too many already. Neutralist movement, what do you call it? The non-aligned movement.
Yeah.
Kennedy is asked by the press, what about this? Commie red, irritation. We think it's okay. They're well-intentioned. We wish them the best. And then behind the scenes, you have our friends, like especially Sukarno and Nkrumah. And I'll tell you just the last thing. John Glenn, the first American orbiter astronaut, his flight, which is after the Russians did it, thrilled mankind, just like Armstrong later. But there was a special edge to it. This is the middle of Kennedy's term. And if you read the coverage at the time, you'll see that aside from Greece and some other country, I forget, Mexico was really strongly part of this. They had a station to observe the flight. So they felt like they were part of it. But the three countries that sent the most strong, thrilled response to President Kennedy were Ghana, Indonesia, and Charles de Gaulle. That's it. That's what's in the news. So the non-aligned movement, there is no honest history of these things. It's ridiculous. It's so far from the headlines of the time. It's like people talking about Lincoln. We have this problem all the time. You go back to Lincoln and you say, well, what did he do before he was president? Well, he was a lawyer or whatever. Oh, God, wasn't he a politician for 30 years? Didn't he have some point of view? Oh, well. Weren't there headlines at the time? Weren't there fights at the time? Oh, well. Doesn't matter. But now it's right in front of us, so that's this problem. Yeah.
When I was watching the picture of Cardenas, it really struck me that it was very similar to the picture of Lynn with Jose Lopez Portillo.
Exactly.
And then when you think back to Lynn, when is Lynn forged? It's 46. It's the British massacre in Calcutta.
Yeah.
And if you think about the early days of our organization, early 70s, with Fred Wills and the 175 nations that supported the IDB, if you think about his development projects with Indira Gandhi, who was assassinated, I mean, the issue in every one of these assassinations was always this question of, industrial development, nuclear power in particular, and industrial development. Every single project that Lynn, every leader in the world that he was meeting with, every assassination that took place, up into, the time of Ponto and Schleyer with the whole development project again for Africa, so it's the continuous history. But I mean, it's really quite striking, that picture, because it was just like the picture of Lynn standing there with Lopez Portillo
Exactly right.
when they dropped the debt bomb.
That's it.
And the world went crazy.
Yeah.
And Ali Bhutto with Kissinger saying, "We will make a terrible example
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Another project of Glenn Seaborg, and I think of Mattei, but definitely Glenn Seaborg, was thermonuclear fusion as a project for the Kennedy administration.
And they actually mentioned thorium
Oh,
in
yes,
that
thorium.
particular,
Yes.
which was obviously a India. I mean, that's what was obviously
Yeah.
being referred to. That's the
And
largest
that's
thorium
right.
reserves in the world.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was quite clear.
Richard.
Yeah, if I could just say one thing.
Yeah, sure.
On this, what's very exciting about all of this is that, and this is where Roosevelt's very much like Lynn. You have an extraordinary group of people, some of whom Tony put up. You have other people like Harry Hopkins. You could list the whole group. It's under Roosevelt that what they had always believed in their life became natural. And they had been fighting against the currents for their whole lives. They suddenly, under Roosevelt, they're able to bat around these ideas and they're able to act on them. And there are probably 50 people who you've never heard of who are remarkable in this regard. I just want to mention one thing about Cook,
Sure.
who was an engineer, but Roosevelt takes him on as governor in 1931, and what he and Roosevelt would do is sit at night after all the work was done and discuss how they were going to bring electricity from the St. Lawrence Seaway. And Roosevelt would sit there and calculate how much electricity could be bought for and so forth. I mean, he's thinking these things through. And then when Roosevelt becomes president, the first thing he appoints Cook to do is to become the head of the Mississippi Valley Commission, which is a commission that oversees 900,000 miles. It's the Missouri River, the Ohio River, the Mississippi, and all the work that was done in these areas, like development of lower Mississippi and so forth, was planned out by this commission starting in 1933. Then Cook privately lobbies Roosevelt to set up the rural electrification administration. He was the guy who did it with Norris. And so Roosevelt says, okay, I'm setting up the 36, you're the first director. And they electrify 900,000 miles of electricity, bringing light to farmers and so forth. So when he goes to this commission in Brazil in 1942-43, he looks at Brazil from those eyes. And for example, he looks at the San Francisco Valley, which is a part in Brazil, and he says, we're going to build a TVA here. He was also one of the best friends of David Lilienthal of the TVA. But he was also, like all of these people, fiercely, fiercely anti-imperialist. And if I could just read one quote from him,
Sure.
I think it conveys it and takes on the things that Tony's been mentioning. That he says that, and he's a complete fight against backwardness, and he's also very much, he says on Brazil repeatedly, we do not just want Brazil to be able to produce raw materials.
Right.
That is wrong.
Right.
We want Brazil to have manufacturing. That's what we have to do. And this is what he says. He says the whole history of industrial civilization, he means the American system of methods, demonstrates that international trade develops best between nations that are prosperous, not between rich nations and poor nations, nor between nations trying to gain prosperity by retarding their neighbors. And then taking direct aim at the British, he says, that we have to reject the 19th century model based on the right of one nation to dominate the lives of other people because of an alleged superiority of race.
Exactly.
And then he adds, later day technological developments, especially in the large-scale production and long-distance transmission of electrical power, have sealed the doom of 19th century trading, in which stronger and more highly developed countries fabricate raw materials great distances to their home country for fabrication, and then send the finished goods to the four corners of the earth. So this is the outlook. I mean, this was a very conscious outlook. And I just want to say one other thing about something else, because you could go on and on. He wrote Roosevelt's 1928 foreign policy speech, in which Roosevelt attacks dollar diplomacy. This was appeared in Foreign Affairs, June of 1928. It was called the Democratic Belief View of Foreign Policy. He wrote it. He also wrote the Good Neighbor speech part of the address, and so on. And he was the guy who also helped develop the UN. Well, he writes Roosevelt's message to Montevideo in late '33. And it stuns everyone. And it's a very simple proposal, which no one could believe. It said, no nation has the right to invade another nation or set a policy. And they just couldn't get over the fact this was coming from the United States. And there's this guy named Puig Calzonac, who was a Mexican, who's foreign minister, and he said, I want to state that we have a very courageous and great man in the White House. And it was just a total transformation. Now, the last thing on what you've been saying about forcing people out, Sumner Welles is forced out in '43. J. Edgar Hoover, working with the British, pulled a dossier, because he had certain things in his background, handed it to Cordell Hull, who at this point was not going in the right direction, clearly, who then marketed it around to the press and basically said, you either fire Sumner Welles in '43, and he's fired in September, or this will become public. So Welles is removed. Then Lawrence Duggan, who you remarked, is then fired and, of course, killed in '48.
Yeah, he was forced out with the allegation circulated internally that he was a homosexual.
Right.
And it's so clearly coming through the same channels that are murdering everybody. The purge against Roosevelt is starting right then, and I think especially after Stalingrad, when they knew that we were going to win the war.
Right.
Right. So.
Just one last thing. He sets up, the last thing I just want to say, which is really exciting, is that in 1939, the United States proposes, under Harry Dexter White, a Bank of the Americas to finance development. And he says he tells other people, tells Morgenthau, we'll put $2 billion, which is like $40 to $50 billion at that time, for the development of the Americas, because that's the right thing to do. When that doesn't succeed, because it's blocked in the Senate, he uses the proposal of the Good Neighbor policy in '41 to then write the original proposals for the Bretton Woods system. So there's a direct continuity between Bretton Woods and the Good Neighbor policy.
So, yeah,
Julia.
go ahead.
When you said that Hurley was aware that, he said that the imperialism is being defended by the blood of democratic nations, and this was the World War II fight.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about how that was clear that that's what World War II was
That's
about
not what the
and
war is about. In other words, we are defending England as we should have, because
Right.
England was being destroyed. That's what he's talking about.
Okay,
But
yeah.
England was governed by imperialists who were using England like in World War I. Winston Churchill sent Englishmen and Canadians and other people to die foolishly at Gallipoli and elsewhere. And that's the enemy isn't England or Britain. The enemy is this policy and this outlook and this set of financiers. And it's all over the world, and it's ancient. And that's something that everybody in power knew, and different from today, it was out there for people to discuss. It was for years and years. That was our culture. That's the point here. I would stress for example, you could say that Franklin Roosevelt didn't do that much. And you could cite, and same thing with Kennedy. Forget the fact that he was killed. And you could cite the fact, and many books are written, that like the Good Neighbor policy was only a partial policy, or that this type of thing was a compromise, or so forth. I think that that's very skewed, because just like in the Civil War and other cases, what it fails to consider is the fact that every second, every minute, there is a war going on to the death between two sides about whether the United States will be the United States or not, literally. And the attitude of those in Wall Street to this present day, along with their teachers in England and Europe, is that They are the authorities. Their friends are the authorities. There is no such a thing as law. There is no such a thing as nations or governments or elected this or that. When Roosevelt was president, when Kennedy was president, and to a certain extent, with Eisenhower and other people, but particularly it's most clear in the cases before us, in what we're citing here. The United States is this outlook. There is no other outlook for the United States. In other words, if somebody says neutralism is communism, that's simply the British Empire speaking. If somebody says, I'm worried about communism, that's a worry. It's an uninformed worry, but it's a worry. And it's real, because there's all kinds of isms running around threatening us and threatening even the countries where they are. What do you do about them? Well, we have a way of dealing with these things. It's called bringing security and civilization to this planet. That's the American policy. And there isn't any other American policy. That's to me is the key concept. Mm-hmm. Rather than say this failed or that failed or this was a compromise, is to get a sense of the very limited occurrence of leadership from the beginning of civilization, where we can find it, where it's the spark of genius in leadership, and it's applied where it can, and it brings about these miracles. And it's not just leadership in statecraft, it's also in other fields. But then when we have these moments under a constitution, that is the United States. And it was ended, I would say, in the enemy's eyes for all time in 1968, when they murdered Bobby Kennedy, who was the one who told Jack, fire Dulles, he's it, he's doing this. And Jack knew these things, but he got Bobby on it. So they murdered him, they murdered Dr. King, and they started up various projects all around the world for the Cultural Revolution, including in China, to end civilization. So if you say, I'm going to find out what the Kennedy assassination was about, you're not interested in that, because the question is, here's the United States and the people who are trying to end the United States. It's as clear as you want it to be, just like in the Civil War. It's the same issue. Only it's worse now because we have atomic bombs, and on the other side, we have, as Morris Cook says, we've changed everything with electricity. We can transform the world. So that's what it is.
Tony, the photo you have on the screen is Hyde Park, FDR's home. If you walk in the door, the very first thing you see, there's a little vestibule. It's got like 15, 20 anti-British editorial cartoons.
That's right.
And the king went, I think, 1937 to visit FDR. The British king did not go to Washington. They went to Hyde Park. And FDR's mother said, the first thing you got to do is take down all these. When he walks in the door, you take your first step, and that's all you see. There's nothing else there. It's a little vestibule. So FDR says, no, we're going to keep all these right here. And sure enough, when the king walks in the door, he is shocked. And he stood and looked and read each one of them one by one. And so FDR wanted to let him read all of them. And then FDR goes up to him when he's done with the last one. He says, so what do you think? The king says, well, I also have a collection of cartoons, but I see you have a few that I don't have.
That's right. You tell it better than I do.
The real reason
That's
is
good. That's right. These are naval cartoons. You read.
Actually, from his grandfather, Isaac Roosevelt, what they said. That's where they.
Well, they must be. Some of them are, but some of them are from the only other war that was directly and officially our war against England, which is the War of 1812. So it was just the Revolution, War of 1812. And here this guy was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I. Where's the modern battleships? So that's all that's on his wall, is these cruisers fighting the British, and then some cartoons of you know, the British as a farcical, bad, stupid enemy. That's good. Yeah.
I want to go back to what you said about Lynn right after the war,
Yes.
going to the leadership of the Indian
Yeah, can you speak up a little bit?
movement. There's a book out in 2010 called Churchill's Secret War, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I've read the summary, and it seems that during the war, Churchill always had this fixation to keep India, of course, because they were very worried what would happen. So just like before the American Revolution, there was a massive famine in Bengal.
Oh, yes.
Same
Oh,
thing
God.
that happened with the East India Company during the war. And they were saying, you know, send us the wheat, send us the ships, and they were available. And Churchill said, I have to save them for Britain after the war is over because we need food. And so 3 million Indians died in Bengal. And that's the context that
Exactly.
Lynn walked into.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was the thing about the whole thing about Roosevelt and the Brits. I'm trying to remember the exact thing, but I think it was at the time of when he was pushing through Lend-Lease to support the British against the Germans, against the onslaught. And he was accused at one point of being an Anglophile because he was, he was from a patrician family and all that, so he was an Anglophile. And he said, on the contrary, I have quite the opposite feelings, and I've had to overcome them.
Yeah, I'd like to get the original for this, but he said that when he went, his father took him to England as a boy, and he saw Queen Victoria, and I hated that woman. That was his comment about it. One other thing to point out, the TVA it obviously is resuming Lincoln's policy of developing the South, Henry Carey's policy, in fact the same places Carey's talking about, to transform the place from poverty into modern times. What did his father have to do with that? James Roosevelt, in 1872, which would be 8 years before he's born, I guess, right? 1880?
81.
81, so 9 years before he's born.
1882.
1872, his father was hired by the Pennsylvania Railroad for a special project to work with, negotiate, we would call network and so forth, in the South with leading people there in and out of Philadelphia, like the heirs of Biddle, to develop railroads and an extension either of the Pennsylvania Railroad or other railroads, maybe new railroads, as a bargain with the South. We will transform the South by building modern transportation here if you will let us go ahead with, the general policy of social improvement and don't mess the country up again. That was interrupted the next year by the destruction of Jay Cook's bank by the Morgans and the British directly. So he only had that job for a year or less. And of course, that was 1873 panic. Then in 1876, there was, even then in 1876, there was a negotiation on that same idea. I don't know if James Roosevelt had something to do with that. But to try to get the Republican Hayes to be president on a bargain to help the South. Not to turn it over to the Ku Klux Klan, but to help them get rich with railroads and industry. And that was turned down by the enemy, including Wall Street and these scoundrels. And then Hayes made the bargain instead of that. It was a fight inside the Republican Party to withdraw the troops from the South and let the clan types run the South and destroy things. So you had this leftover problem that his father was in the middle of, and his father's networks go. Obviously, I don't know that there's I don't think you know that you can claim a continual awareness of everything going back to Isaac Roosevelt. Clearly, Franklin Roosevelt chose Isaac Roosevelt as his favorite ancestor. Right? He certainly didn't want to choose his mother's father, who's in the opium business. Right? How many of us have thieves or drunkards or whatever as ancestors, but also great people? So we choose we have millions of ancestors, right? So, but the awareness of these things as a historical memory, this is what Graham is always talking about, right? On our side and the enemy's side. This is a historical memory in his family. And he's practicing this as governor of New York. And this is America's memory. Went to sleep, and then he revived it.
During the Boer War, when the British fought the Dutch, he collected money for the Boers at Harvard University.
I didn't know that.
So my ambition for this is to produce a beautiful documentary video. These slides and all of this work was done here by Asuka and Pavel for many hours of creative work and incredible amounts of work. At one point, Adam Sturman told me that I said, well, can I just do some slides? And he laughed at me. And typical Adam, right? You don't know anything about this. You can't do this. And he was right.
That's great.
So there's there's about 200 of these in this?
Yeah.
Yeah, about 200. I'll tell you a methodology that's involved here, and that is you have a search function through the public library to a database of New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and Christian Science Monitor. All of them directly representative of the enemy. And in previous decades, you'd have to go to the Library of Congress and go through microfilm. There was a New York Times index, but it was terribly laborious, and it was so exciting to discover anything. And of course, you can't start by looking through the newspapers for anything. You have to know what you're looking for. But then, just like when you go into a library, remember going in the stacks of the Library of Congress or someplace like that? You go there, you look for a book, and then you peek next to it.
Yes.
Oh,
And up
this
and
subject
down
is
and
close to that.
around, yeah.
What's going on here?
Yeah.
And that's like this. You look in the neighborhood of this date, and even with this, searching for this thing, and you find, my God, why hasn't this been reported? You know, what about this, the Hurley Memorandum? It's as I said, an effort to get Hurley to write this, or FDR saying he's going to get Hurley to write the memorandum in Iran. That's reported by Elliott Roosevelt. Other writers with a lot of money and prestige or whatever, or at least universities and funding and so forth, they would say repeatedly that Acheson circulated this scurrilous attack. He called it hysterical messianic globaloney. That phrase was coined by Acheson's assistant. He was an assistant in the State Department, and his assistant was Eugene Rostow. Later, later a Vietnam War hawk and a neocon. Mm-hmm. So he's the one who made that phrase up. So that attack is reported. These Senate hearings where he's bringing these out isn't reported at all, where that's now in the headlines. But this is reported in biographies and things like this. So I went to the archives in Maryland. What's the name of the place there? Suitland. And I went to the purported folder where this Atchison letter, I wanted to see, well, who's he writing this letter to? Maybe it was supposed to be to Stettinius, who's later Secretary of State after Hull. It's not in the file. And I'm fuming. Because the author who wrote about this with a footnote about that would not return my phone calls or my emails. He's a big professor. I can't find this damn thing. It may have just got lost, or maybe misfiled, or maybe somebody stole it, or maybe the family did away with it. But in that same physical folder is this Hurley memorandum that he's responding to. Mm-hmm. And the woman who's the librarian there, the archivist, is thrilled about all this. Because she knows this subject, she loves this subject, she loves FDR, she loves, we're fighting Hitler, we're discovering things about the universe, this is like God to her. And so, I picked this out, and it's never been published. Why not? That's ridiculous. That is our policy. And that today, Jeff Steinberg circulated that memorandum already to people in Iran. And this is exciting to them. That's our policy. That's America's policy.
Before
So
Mossadegh.
Yeah. Before Mossadegh?
No, but I mean that.
Oh.
That's what many Iranians think of America as, the ones who have real history before the
That's right.
before the overthrow of the Shah. People who have knowledge of ancient history know back to Mossadegh.
Yeah.
Before Mossadegh.
Yeah.
It goes back further, because during the American Revolution and that whole period, the people that we were working with throughout Europe included Morocco, included countries all over the region.
That's right.
That, and the main point that you made at the end is this question that all of these technologies are of course what man will do if man is freed to fight for the dignity of man, which is embedded in our Declaration of Independence.
Right.
And that is, as you said, that is the war between our outlook on man and this British imperialist filth.
Yeah. Claudio Celani wrote some really fantastic articles about Mattei.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And recently, 2009, he wrote about British memos coming out just before Mattei was killed in 1962,
Right.
where the Prime Minister, was it Macmillan or the other guy, I don't know, but he says, we're finished. Europe is dominated by our enemies. We're losing everything. We're losing the Americans are selling weapons to people that we're supposed to be selling weapons. We have nothing. We're being destroyed. All we have left is our determination. And Dean Andromedus has written extensively about the earlier Iran presence of the Americans. But you're right, exactly right, to go back to the revolution. This is our identity in the world. But then in 1911 and 12, Iran was jointly governed by Russia and England. And it was right after that that Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, took the measure to say that the British Empire, the British government, is buying up half or something of the Anglo-Iranian oil company, later known as BP. So this is a British imperial enterprise government, top down. The Iranians had a revolt against this setup around the beginning of the century. The British and Russians signed an accord in 1907, backed by Teddy Roosevelt, to kick off the planning towards World War I, to carve up Iran, to govern the nations from India over to Europe. and to bully Iran. The Iranians revolted against this in a constitutional revolt. They set up the Majlis, the parliament, and they invited the Americans, the famous Americans of Abraham Lincoln, to send somebody there who would be the treasurer of Iran. And this is Schuster. I forget his first name now. It's late. But he went there. He had been in the Philippines. And he went to Iran as the treasurer of Iran.
Huh.
And he set up a military squad, a big military squad for the Treasury Department to stand up to the British
Wow.
and the agents of the aristocrats and the Russians. They fought it out. He stood his ground. And the British were foaming at the mouth, and they and the Russians got together. The Russians are pitiful and pathetic. They've already had the Japanese sicked on them. So there's a dying czar operation. And Witte is furious that this is stupid. The Russians should be doing this. And the British condemned the American interference, and they got the Russians to invade Iran. The American was kicked out, and the parliament was ended, and Iran was smashed. When Franklin Roosevelt was president, this was the recent memory in Iran of the heroic Americans coming to our rescue. We couldn't do anything then under Roosevelt because that's the middle of World War II. We're supplying Russia. Russians are coming back and forth. The whole war between Africa and Europe and Asia, that's a central place. So we couldn't build something there right then. But that was supposed to be the centerpiece of the development of the world because it's so hard to do and because clearly they have a culture that is ready to go. You talk about Brazil, I mean, my God, Iran developed India in ancient times. Right. That's the seat of culture. So that's their memory. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.